In the final months of 1944, as World War II raged on, Adolf Hitler and his high command devised a desperate and audacious plan that would become one of the most famous and infamous battles in military history, the Battle of the Bulge. This was Hitler's last significant offensive in the West, a massive and unexpected attack intended to split the Allied forces, capture the critical port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace on terms favorable to the Third Reich. For the German military, already stretched to its limits by fighting on multiple fronts, this was a high-risk, high-reward gamble that would either turn the tide of the war or lead to complete and total defeat. The European theater of World War II, by late 1944, was a landscape of stark contrasts. On one side, the Allies had gained significant momentum following the success of Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. This monumental invasion marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, as Allied forces, consisting primarily of American, British, and Canadian troops, surged through France, liberating Paris by August and pushing the German army back toward its own borders. The rapid advance, however, was not without challenges. The Allied forces faced stiff resistance from the German Wehrmacht, which, despite suffering severe losses, continued to fight with the desperation of an army defending its homeland. The Eastern Front also painted a grim picture for Germany. The Red Army of the Soviet Union had launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, a massive offensive that decimated Army Group Center and pushed German forces back to the borders of Poland. The Soviets, now firmly on the offensive, were preparing to enter Germany from the east. Hitler's Third Reich was being squeezed from both sides, with little room left for retreat. Amidst this backdrop, Adolf Hitler and his high command were grappling with the reality that Germany's situation was becoming increasingly dire. The rapid Allied advances across France and the Low Countries had placed the German military on the defensive, and the war, which once seemed destined for a German victory, now appeared to be slipping out of their grasp. Despite these setbacks, Hitler remained unyielding in his determination to turn the tide of the war. This resolve led to the conception of a bold and risky plan, a counteroffensive that would aim to split the Allied forces and capture the critical Belgian port of Antwerp, thereby crippling the Allied supply lines and forcing a negotiated peace in Germany's favor. The success of Operation Overlord had paved the way for a relentless Allied push toward Germany. By the fall of 1944, the Allies had liberated much of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The rapid advance, however, was met with increasing logistical challenges. Supply lines stretched back to the Normandy beaches, and the advance units were often forced to pause to await the arrival of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Despite these issues, the morale among Allied troops was high, buoyed by the belief that the war in Europe might be over by Christmas. The Battle of Aachen in October 1944 was a key moment in the Allied advance toward Germany. Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies, was fiercely defended by the Wehrmacht, and its capture was a significant psychological blow to Nazi Germany. However, the battle also revealed the German army's tenacity and the difficulties the Allies would face as they moved closer to the German heartland. As winter approached, the Allies planned to continue their advance into Germany through the Siegfried Line, a formidable network of defensive fortifications that ran along Germany's western border. However, the rugged terrain of the Ardennes, a region of dense forests and rolling hills, was not seen as a likely route for a major offensive. The Allies, believing that the Germans were on the verge of collapse, did not anticipate a large-scale counterattack in this area. In contrast to the optimism among the Allies, the situation in Germany was becoming increasingly desperate. The loss of France, coupled with the Soviet advance in the east, left the German military stretched thin. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force in the skies over Europe, was now a shadow of its former self, with many of its best pilots lost in earlier battles and its aircraft production severely hampered by Allied bombing raids. Hitler, however, was not ready to concede defeat. Despite the advice of some of his generals to adopt a more defensive strategy, Hitler believed that a decisive counteroffensive could change the course of the war. His plan, which became known as the Ardennes Offensive or the Battle of the Bulge, was ambitious and fraught with risks. Hitler envisioned a surprise attack through the Ardennes, an area he believed the Allies had left weakly defended. The goal was to break through the Allied lines, encircle and destroy four Allied armies, and capture Antwerp, a crucial supply port. The stakes for Germany could not have been higher. The offensive was not just a military gamble, but a last-ditch effort to force the Allies into negotiations that could preserve the Nazi regime. Hitler's refusal to accept the strategic realities of the situation led to the commitment of the last reserves of the German army, including elite panzer divisions, to this audacious plan. For the German soldiers who would carry out the offensive, the battle would be their final, desperate bid to stave off the inevitable defeat of the Third Reich. The German counteroffensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was conceived in secrecy by Hitler and his closest military advisors. The plan was audacious, to say the least. It called for a massive concentration of German forces in the Ardennes, a region that had been the site of a German offensive 4 years earlier during the invasion of France. The choice of the Ardennes was strategic. Its dense forests and hilly terrain would offer cover for the massing of troops and vehicles, and the Allies, overconfident in their recent successes, had left the region lightly defended. Hitler's objectives were clear, but exceedingly ambitious. The primary goal was to split the Allied armies along the Western Front by driving a wedge between the British and American forces. This would be achieved by a rapid advance to the River Meuse, followed by a push to capture Antwerp. The seizure of Antwerp was critical, as it was the primary supply port for the Allied armies. Without it, the Allies would be forced to retreat, potentially leading to a disintegration of the coalition and opening the door to negotiations that could leave Germany in control of much of Western Europe. The planning for Operation Wacht am Rhein was carried out with the utmost secrecy. Only a select few within the German high command were privy to the full details of the operation. To maintain the element of surprise, the German forces involved were placed under strict orders to avoid any actions that might tip off the Allies to the impending offensive. The movement of troops and equipment into the Ardennes was conducted primarily at night, and the Germans employed elaborate deception measures to mask their intentions. Despite the careful planning, the operation was fraught with risks. The German army was a shadow of its former self, and the resources available for the offensive were limited. Fuel shortages were a significant concern, as the offensive relied heavily on mechanized units, including tanks and trucks, which consumed large amounts of gasoline. To mitigate this, the Germans planned to capture Allied fuel depots along the route of the offensive. Additionally, the German forces had to contend with the deteriorating quality of their troops. Many of the soldiers assigned to the offensive were either inexperienced conscripts or older men recalled to service. The success of the operation also hinged on the weather. The Ardennes region in December was known for its harsh winter conditions, with frequent snowstorms and low visibility. While this posed challenges for the German troops, it also offered an advantage by grounding the Allied air forces, which had played a crucial role in earlier battles. The Germans hoped that the bad weather would continue, allowing them to advance under the cover of clouds and snow. One of the most critical factors in the initial success of the German offensive was the failure of Allied intelligence to detect the buildup of German forces in the Ardennes. The Allies had grown complacent in the belief that the German army was on the verge of collapse. Reports of German troop movements in the region were dismissed as insignificant, and the possibility of a major German counteroffensive was not seriously considered. The Allies' focus was primarily on their own offensive operations. In the north, British and Canadian forces were engaged in the Battle of the Scheldt, while American forces were pushing through the Hürtgen Forest, a grueling and costly campaign that had sapped the strength of many American units. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and difficult terrain, was seen as a quiet sector where inexperienced or depleted units could be sent to rest and refit. German deception efforts also played a role in blinding the Allies to the impending attack. The Germans went to great lengths to conceal their preparations, including the use of radio silence, fake troop movements, and the dissemination of false intelligence. The few Allied officers who expressed concern about the possibility of a German offensive were largely ignored or overruled by higher command. The failure of Allied intelligence was compounded by the weather. The thick fog and snow that blanketed the Ardennes in the days leading up to the offensive made aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible. As a result, the concentration of German forces in the region went largely unnoticed. The logistical challenges of assembling and supplying a large force for the offensive were immense. The German army had to move nearly 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces into position without alerting the Allies. This was achieved through a combination of meticulous planning and extraordinary discipline on the part of the troops involved. Troop movements were conducted primarily at night to avoid detection by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The Germans also made extensive use of camouflage to conceal their forces. Tanks and artillery were hidden under the dense forest canopy, and entire units were kept off the roads during daylight hours. In some cases, roads were widened or reinforced to accommodate the heavy vehicles that would spearhead the offensive. Supplying such a large force was another significant challenge. The German supply system was already under tremendous strain due to the prolonged conflict, and the rapid advance envisioned in the Ardennes offensive required careful logistical planning. Fuel, in particular, was a critical concern. The German army was suffering from severe fuel shortages, and the offensive success depended on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the advance. The German High Command had calculated that their forces would need to capture at least 3 million liters of fuel to reach Antwerp, a goal that would prove to be a significant obstacle as the battle progressed. Additionally, the movement of supplies had to be conducted with utmost secrecy. The Germans relied heavily on rail transport to move ammunition, fuel, and other essential supplies to the front lines, but the rail network was vulnerable to Allied air attacks. To mitigate this risk, the Germans stockpiled supplies in advance and created hidden depots throughout the Ardennes, which were then gradually moved closer to the front as the offensive drew near. Communication was another vital aspect of the logistical preparations. The German High Command established a network of command posts and communication lines that would allow them to coordinate the movements of their forces during the offensive. This network was designed to be resilient to disruption, with backup lines and alternative communication methods in place to ensure that orders could be transmitted even under heavy Allied attack. The German forces involved in the Ardennes offensive were a mix of seasoned veterans and new recruits. Elite units, such as the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, were positioned at the spearhead of the offensive, tasked with breaking through the Allied lines and driving toward the Meuse River. These units were reinforced with additional infantry divisions, artillery, and support units, creating a formidable force that would strike with overwhelming power. However, many of the troops assigned to the offensive were inexperienced or poorly equipped. The German army had been severely depleted by years of attrition, and the Ardennes offensive drew in units from across the western and eastern fronts. This included Volksgrenadiers, units composed of older men, wounded soldiers returning to the front, and young conscripts. While these troops were often motivated by a sense of duty or desperation, their lack of experience and training would become a significant factor as the battle unfolded. The German High Command was also acutely aware of the need to maintain momentum during the offensive. The initial breakthrough would be critical, and the Germans planned to exploit any weaknesses in the Allied lines with rapid, decisive action. To this end, they assembled a large number of mechanized units, including tanks and armored vehicles, to push through the Ardennes and into the heart of the Allied rear areas. As the German forces moved into position, tension mounted among the soldiers. They knew that they were about to undertake a mission of immense importance, one that could determine the fate of the entire war. Many were aware of the risks involved, particularly the reliance on capturing fuel and the need to maintain the element of surprise. Nevertheless, the sense of purpose and determination among the troops was palpable. For them, the Ardennes offensive was not just a military operation. It was a final chance to turn the tide of a war that had brought untold suffering to their homeland. On the eve of the Ardennes offensive, the Allied forces stationed in the region were largely unaware of the storm that was about to break over them. The Ardennes front, which stretched across parts of Belgium and Luxembourg, was considered a quiet sector, where troops could rest and recuperate after the intense fighting of previous campaigns. The Allied forces in this area were a mix of American units, including the First Army and elements of the Third Army, along with British and Canadian forces in reserve. The Allied disposition in the Ardennes was shaped by the belief that the German army was on the brink of collapse. High-ranking officers, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, believed that the German military was too weak to launch a major offensive. As a result, the Ardennes sector was lightly defended, with many units under strength or composed of inexperienced soldiers. This included the 106th Infantry Division, which had recently arrived in the region and was still acclimating to the harsh winter conditions. The terrain of the Ardennes further contributed to the Allied complacency. The region was characterized by dense forests, steep hills, and narrow roads, which made large-scale military operations difficult. The Allied commanders assumed that the Germans would not attempt an offensive through such challenging terrain, especially in the middle of winter. Instead, they expected the Germans to continue defending their positions along the Siegfried Line, where the Allies were preparing for their own offensive. The weather and terrain of the Ardennes would play a crucial role in the coming battle. In December 1944, the region was experiencing one of the harshest winters in living memory. Snow blanketed the ground, and temperatures regularly dipped below freezing. The dense fog and low clouds that hung over the Ardennes made visibility poor, creating an eerie, foreboding atmosphere. For the German forces, the weather was both a blessing and a curse. The thick fog and snowstorms provided cover for their movements, helping to maintain the element of surprise. Allied reconnaissance planes were grounded, unable to observe the buildup of German forces, and the roads were often impassable, forcing the Germans to rely on foot patrols and small convoys to move their troops and supplies. However, the weather also posed significant challenges. The cold was brutal, and many German soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. Frostbite and exposure became common, sapping the strength and morale of the troops. The snow-covered roads were treacherous, and vehicles often became stuck or broke down, further complicating the already difficult task of moving men and material to the front lines. The terrain of the Ardennes, with its thick forests and narrow, winding roads, was equally challenging. The region's geography was characterized by a series of ridges and valleys, which created natural choke points that could easily be defended by a determined enemy. The dense forest limited visibility and made communication and coordination between units difficult. For the Germans, who were relying on a rapid advance to achieve their objectives, the terrain would prove to be a significant obstacle. The weather and terrain also affected the Allied forces in the Ardennes. Many of the American soldiers stationed in the region were unprepared for the harsh winter conditions. Like their German counterparts, they suffered from frostbite and exposure, and their equipment often failed in the cold. The snow and ice made movement difficult, and the thick forests hampered their ability to detect and respond to German troop movements. Despite these challenges, the weather and terrain ultimately worked to the Germans' advantage in the initial stages of the offensive. The Allies, lulled into a false sense of security by the belief that the Ardennes was a quiet sector, were caught off guard by the scale and ferocity of the German attack. As the night of December 15th, 1944, fell over the Ardennes, both sides made their final preparations for the battle that was about to begin. For the Germans, this was the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning and careful movement. The troops, having moved into their final assembly areas, were briefed on their objectives and the importance of the mission. Many German officers spoke to their men about the significance of the coming offensive, emphasizing that it was a final chance to turn the tide of the war. Morale among the German troops was mixed. While some were motivated by a sense of duty and the desire to defend their homeland, others were exhausted by years of fighting and skeptical about the prospects of success. The logistical challenges, particularly the fuel shortages, weighed heavily on the minds of many soldiers. Nevertheless, the sense of anticipation was palpable, and the soldiers knew that they were about to be part of a historic moment in the war. On the Allied side, there was little indication that anything unusual was about to happen. The troops stationed in the Ardennes were going about their routine duties, unaware of the massive force gathering just a few miles away. Some American units had noted an increase in German patrol activity, but this was not considered significant. The front was quiet, and many soldiers were looking forward to a relatively uneventful Christmas. The Allied commanders were also unprepared for what was coming. Intelligence reports from various sources had suggested that the Germans were planning an offensive, but the consensus among the Allied high command was that any such attack would be minor and easily repelled. The Ardennes sector, with its difficult terrain and lack of strategic significance, was not considered a likely target. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the German forces completed their final preparations. Artillery units moved into position, ready to unleash a devastating barrage on the Allied lines at first light. Infantry and panzer divisions, poised to strike, waited in the cold darkness for the order to advance. The tension was almost unbearable as the soldiers braced themselves for the battle that would soon engulf the Ardennes. The night of December 15th, 1944, was the last calm before the storm. By the morning of December 16th, the landscape of the Ardennes would be forever changed, as the quiet forests and snow-covered hills erupted into one of the fiercest and most consequential battles of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. As dawn broke on December 16th, 1944, the quiet of the Ardennes forest was shattered by the thunderous roar of artillery. The German assault began with a massive barrage that pounded the American lines along a 60-mile front. Over 1,600 artillery pieces, mortars, and Nebelwerfers, screaming Memis, unleashed a relentless rain of shells on the unsuspecting Allied forces. The initial bombardment was concentrated on key sectors, with the aim of disrupting communication lines, destroying command posts, and sowing chaos among the defenders. The artillery barrage was followed by the advance of German infantry and armored divisions, which surged forward through the thick fog and snow. The Germans had carefully planned their attack to coincide with the worst weather conditions, knowing that the overcast skies would keep the Allied air forces grounded. This gave the Germans a crucial advantage, as they could move their troops and tanks without fear of being strafed or bombed from above. In the northern sector of the Ardennes front, the 6th Panzer Army, under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, spearheaded the attack. This elite formation, which included the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, was tasked with breaking through the American lines and driving westward to capture Antwerp. The 6th Panzer Army struck at the junction between the U.S. 99th Infantry Division and the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division, quickly overwhelming the thinly spread American defenses. The American troops, many of whom were fresh from basic training and had never experienced combat, were caught completely off guard. The German assault was swift and brutal, with tanks and infantry storming through the fog, firing at anything that moved. In many cases, the American soldiers had little time to react before being overrun. Some units managed to put up a spirited defense, but the sheer weight of the German attack soon forced them to retreat or surrender. To the south, the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Otto von Manschufel, launched its attack against the U.S. 28th and 4th Infantry Divisions. The 5th Panzer Army's objective was to advance through the Ardennes and seize the vital road junctions at Bastogne and Saint-Vith, which were crucial for controlling the movement of troops and supplies in the region. Like the 6th Panzer Army, Manchufel's forces benefited from the element of surprise and the poor weather, which allowed them to advance rapidly in the early hours of the offensive. The initial German successes were impressive. In many areas, the American lines were shattered, and the German tanks and infantry poured through the gaps, advancing several miles on the first day. The Allies were thrown into disarray, with communication lines cut and units isolated from one another. The dense fog and snow further contributed to the confusion, making it difficult for the Americans to organize a coherent defense or even understand the full scale of the attack. Despite the chaos, there were pockets of determined resistance. At the village of Lanzerath, for example, a small force of American soldiers from the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, held off a much larger German force for almost an entire day. Led by Lieutenant Lyle Bauch, this group of 18 men managed to inflict significant casualties on the advancing Germans before they were eventually captured. Their stand delayed the advance of the 6th Panzer Army and allowed other American units to begin organizing a defense. In other areas, American artillery units played a crucial role in slowing down the German advance. Although the Germans had targeted many of the American artillery positions during the initial bombardment, some batteries managed to survive and continue firing. The 106th Infantry Division's artillery, for example, provided critical support to the beleaguered infantry, laying down a curtain of fire that temporarily halted the German tanks. However, the sheer weight of the German assault meant that even these efforts could only delay the inevitable. The Germans achieved several significant breakthroughs on the first day of the offensive, exploiting weaknesses in the Allied lines and taking advantage of the element of surprise. One of the most critical breakthrough sectors was the Losheim Gap, a low-lying area near the town of Losheim that had been identified by the Germans as a weak point in the American defenses. The 1st SS Panzer Division, part of the 6th Panzer Army, concentrated its attack on this sector, quickly overrunning the American positions and opening a wide corridor for the German forces to advance. Another key breakthrough occurred in the Schnee-Eifel region, where the 18th Volksgrenadier Division and the 560th Volksgrenadier Division managed to encircle and cut off 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division. The Schnee-Eifel, a hilly area with dense forests, had been lightly defended by the Americans, who believed that the rugged terrain would be sufficient to deter any large-scale German attack. But the Germans used the hills and forests to their advantage. They launched a surprise attack that trapped almost 7,000 American soldiers. Losing these 2 regiments was one of the biggest single defeats the U.S. Army suffered during the entire war. The southern part of the Ardennes front also saw big German gains. The 5th Panzer Army broke through the 1st American defenses and headed toward Bastogne, a very important crossroads that controlled how troops and supplies moved in the area. Bastogne was defended by the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, which was quickly moved to the front when the attack started. Even though the Germans at first went around Bastogne to reach the Meuse River, the town would soon become the main focus of the battle. In the middle part, the town of St. Vith became another important place to fight. The 5th Panzer Army wanted to capture St. Vith quickly to control the important roads in the area. But the town was defended by parts of the U.S. 7th Armored Division and the 106th Infantry Division, which fought back hard. The battle for St. Vith lasted for several days, and both sides lost a lot of soldiers fighting for control of the town. The German breakthroughs on the first day of the attack made the Allied forces feel very scared. News of German tanks and soldiers going deep into the American lines spread quickly, often made worse by the confusion and chaos of the battlefield. Many American units had to retreat in a mess, leaving their positions and equipment behind as they tried to escape the advancing Germans. The sudden German attack on December 16, 1944, threw the Allied forces into a mess. The surprise attack, bad weather, and the huge size of the German attack made a situation of chaos and confusion across the Ardennes front. Communication problems, conflicting reports, and the fast advance of German forces made it hard for the Allies to understand what was happening and fight back effectively. One of the first problems the Allies faced was a breakdown in communication. The German artillery had cut many of the telephone lines that connected the front-line units to their headquarters, making it impossible for commanders to coordinate their defenses or ask for reinforcements. The thick fog and snow made the problem worse, as radio signals were often unreliable and visual signals were impossible to see. As a result, many American units were left to fight on their own, with little help from higher command. The confusion was made worse by the fast movement of German forces, which created a battlefield that was constantly changing. Reports of German breakthroughs were often out of date by the time they reached headquarters, and commanders struggled to keep track of the front lines. In some cases, American units found themselves surrounded or cut off without knowing it, as the Germans advanced through the dense forests and rough terrain. The thick fog of war led to several cases of friendly fire, as panicked American soldiers shot at anything that moved in the mist-shrouded woods. The chaotic nature of the battle also led to incidents of misidentification, where German troops, sometimes dressed in American uniforms or driving captured American vehicles, were able to sneak into Allied lines. These infiltration tactics, carried out by units like Otto Skorzeny's 150th Panzer Brigade, added to the feeling of paranoia and confusion among the Allied forces. The response from the Allied High Command in the first days of the attack was hesitant and fragmented. Many senior officers were at first skeptical of the reports coming from the front lines, believing that the attacks were isolated incidents rather than part of a coordinated German offensive. This skepticism led to delays in ordering reinforcements and in reorienting the Allied forces to counter the German advance. General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was initially caught off guard by the scale of the German attack. On the morning of December 16th, he was informed of the German offensive, but was initially told that it was a limited counterattack. It was only as the day progressed and more reports came in that the true extent of the offensive became apparent. Eisenhower quickly realized that the situation was dire and that immediate action was needed to prevent a total collapse of the front. In response to the crisis, Eisenhower ordered the deployment of reserves, including the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, to reinforce the threatened sectors. These elite units, veterans of the Normandy and Market Garden campaigns, were rushed to the front by truck and on foot, often arriving just in time to bolster the faltering American defenses. However, the rapid deployment of these units was hampered by the poor weather and the congested roads. The thick Ardennes forest and the region's rugged terrain posed significant challenges for both sides during the early days of the offensive. For the Germans, the dense woods offered concealment, allowing their troops and armor to move undetected, while the narrow, winding roads hindered the rapid deployment of their mechanized units. These roads, often little more than dirt tracks, quickly became bottlenecks as columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry tried to push through the dense forest. The poor state of the roads also slowed down the advance of the German forces. The narrowness of the routes meant that if a single vehicle broke down or was destroyed by Allied artillery or airstrikes, the entire column could be delayed for hours. The muddy and icy conditions further complicated the situation, leading to frequent accidents and breakdowns. German engineers worked tirelessly to repair roads and bridges, often under fire, but the sheer volume of traffic and the challenging weather made it a constant struggle to maintain the pace of the advance. The roads and terrain were equally problematic for the Americans. As they tried to organize a defense, many units found themselves trying to navigate through the same narrow roads and tracks that the Germans were using for their advance. The confusion was made worse by the fog and snow, which made it hard to tell friend from foe. In many cases, retreating American units collided with advancing German forces, leading to chaotic and deadly encounters. The road network in the Ardennes was crucial to the success of the German offensive. Key road junctions at towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vith became focal points of the battle, as both sides understood the importance of controlling these critical choke points. The Germans needed to secure these junctions to ensure the flow of troops and supplies to the front lines, while the Americans knew that holding them would disrupt the German advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. Despite the confusion and the overwhelming nature of the German assault, several American units managed to mount determined defenses in the first days of the battle. These actions, though often isolated and improvised, played a crucial role in delaying the German advance and preventing a complete collapse of the front. One of the most notable examples of American resistance occurred at the village of Bastogne. As the 5th Panzer Army advanced through the Ardennes, it became clear that Bastogne, with its network of 7 roads radiating out in all directions, was a key objective. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, was rushed to Bastogne to hold the town at all costs. The defense of Bastogne was marked by a series of desperate actions as the Americans sought to hold off the German attackers. The 101st Airborne, under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, dug in and prepared to defend the town against overwhelming odds. The Germans quickly surrounded Bastogne, cutting off all supply lines and subjecting the defenders to relentless artillery and tank attacks. Despite the isolation and the bitter cold, the American paratroopers held their ground, repelling repeated German assaults and inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. The siege of Bastogne would become one of the most famous episodes of the Battle of the Bulge. McAuliffe's defiant response to a German surrender demand, nuts, becoming a symbol of American determination and resilience. Another critical defensive action took place at Saint-Vith, where elements of the U.S. 7th Armored Division, along with remnants of the 106th Infantry Division, mounted a stubborn defense. The town of Saint-Vith was a vital road junction, and its capture was essential for the Germans to continue their advance westward. The defenders, led by General Bruce C. Clark, managed to hold out against repeated German attacks for several days, delaying the German timetable and forcing them to divert resources. The defense of Saint-Vith, like that of Bastogne, was characterized by intense close-quarters combat, with American and German forces often fighting within sight of one another. The Americans used the terrain to their advantage, setting up ambushes and using the dense woods to conceal their positions. Artillery played a crucial role in the defense, with American gunners laying down barges that disrupted German attacks and inflicted heavy casualties. Despite the eventual fall of Saint-Vith on December 21st, the delay caused by the defense of the town had a significant impact on the overall battle. The time gained allowed the Allies to reinforce their positions and begin to mount a coordinated counterattack. The early days of the Battle of the Bulge were marked by heavy casualties on both sides. The German forces, despite their initial successes, suffered significant losses as they advanced through the Ardennes. The Americans, caught off guard and outnumbered, also paid a heavy price in men and material. The conditions in the Ardennes were brutal. The freezing temperatures, deep snow, and dense fog created a nightmarish environment for the soldiers on both sides. Frostbite and exposure were constant threats, and many soldiers succumbed to the elements as they fought to hold or take ground. The cold also affected equipment, with vehicles breaking down and weapons jamming, adding to the challenges faced by the troops. The chaotic nature of the battle led to high casualties among frontline units. American infantrymen, often outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperately to hold their positions against waves of German tanks and infantry. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, with soldiers on both sides engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. The dense forests and fog made it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead, creating a tense and terrifying atmosphere. Soldiers moved through the woods, never knowing when they might encounter the enemy. The Germans, for their part, also suffered heavy losses. The initial success of their offensive came at a high cost, with many units experiencing significant casualties. The dense forests and narrow roads made it difficult for German armor to maneuver, and many tanks and vehicles were lost to American artillery and anti-tank weapons. The Germans also faced supply shortages, particularly in fuel. This limited the mobility of their mechanized units and slowed the pace of their advance. The human toll of the battle was not limited to the soldiers on the front lines. Civilians living in the Ardennes region found themselves caught in the middle of the fighting. Many villages and towns were destroyed in the fighting, and civilians were forced to flee their homes in the freezing cold, often with little more than the clothes on their backs. The German advance created a wave of refugees. Thousands of people sought safety behind the Allied lines. The sight of civilians trudging through the snow, carrying their belongings and children, added to the grim reality of the battle. The chaotic and brutal nature of the early days of the Battle of the Bulge set the stage for what would become one of the most intense and significant battles of World War II. As the initial shock of the German offensive began to wear off, the Allies started to regroup and plan their response. The coming weeks would see some of the fiercest fighting of the war, as both sides fought desperately for control of the Ardennes. St. Vith, a small but strategically vital town in the Ardennes, became a focal point of the German offensive in the Battle of the Bulge. The town's significance lay in its location at the junction of several key roads that were essential for the movement of German forces and supplies. The capture of St. Vith was a top priority for the 5th Panzer Army, which sought to use the town as a springboard for further advances into Belgium. The defense of St. Vith was led by the U.S. 7th Armored Division, commanded by General Robert W. Hasbrouck, along with elements of the 106th Infantry Division and other units that had been hastily assembled to defend the town. The defenders were well aware of the importance of their position and were determined to hold St. Vith at all costs, despite being outnumbered and facing some of the most elite units of the German army. The battle for St. Vith began on December 17, 1944, as German forces launched a series of probing attacks against the American defenses. The initial assaults were repelled, but the Germans quickly escalated their efforts, bringing in more troops and armor. The fighting intensified over the next several days, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The terrain around St. Vith favored the defenders. The town was surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, which made it difficult for the German tanks to maneuver. The American defenders used the terrain to their advantage, setting up strong points in the woods and along the ridgelines. Artillery played a crucial role in the defense, with American gunners using pre-registered targets to rain down fire on the advancing Germans. As the battle wore on, the Germans began to encircle St. Vith, cutting off the town from the rest of the American forces. The weather continued to be a significant factor, with heavy snow and fog making it difficult for both sides to move or see. Despite the worsening conditions, the defenders of St. Vith held their ground, repelling wave after wave of German attacks. The turning point in the battle came on December 21st, when the Germans launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions, supported by heavy artillery and air strikes. The American defenders, exhausted and running low on ammunition, were finally forced to withdraw from the town. The loss of St. Vith was a significant blow to the Allies, as it opened up the road network to the Germans and allowed them to push further into the Ardennes. However, the defense of St. Vith, which had delayed the German advance for several crucial days, also had a significant impact on the overall battle. The American withdrawal from St. Vith was conducted in an orderly fashion, with the defenders falling back to new positions to the west. General Hasbrouck and his staff managed to coordinate the retreat, avoiding a complete rout and ensuring that the bulk of their forces could continue to fight another day. The delay caused by the defense of St. Vith had forced the Germans to divert resources from other parts of the front and had disrupted their timetable for the offensive. In the aftermath of the battle, St. Vith lay in ruins. The town had been almost completely destroyed by the fighting, with most of the buildings reduced to rubble. The streets were littered with the wreckage of destroyed tanks and vehicles, and the bodies of fallen soldiers lay frozen in the snow. The few civilians who had remained in the town during the battle now faced the grim task of rebuilding their lives in the midst of the devastation. Despite the loss of St. Vith, the American defense of the town was considered a significant success. The delay it caused allowed the Allies to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the battle. It also demonstrated the resilience and determination of the American soldiers, who had managed to hold out against overwhelming odds for several days. The defense of St. Vith was one of the key engagements of the Battle of the Bulge, and it exemplified the brutal and chaotic nature of the fighting in the Ardennes. The town's fall marked the high point of the German advance, but it also signaled the beginning of the end for the offensive as the Allies began to turn the tide. While St. Vith was a critical battle, the Siege of Bastogne became the most iconic and celebrated engagement of the Battle of the Bulge. Bastogne, like St. Vith, was a vital crossroads town, with roads leading in all directions that were essential for the German advance. Recognizing its importance, the Germans made capturing Bastogne a priority, while the Allies understood that holding the town was crucial to preventing the Germans from achieving their objectives. The defense of Bastogne was entrusted to the 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The division, along with elements of other units, was hastily deployed to Bastogne as the German offensive began. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were seasoned veterans, having fought in Normandy and the Netherlands, but they faced a daunting task in Bastogne. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by the German forces. The Siege of Bastogne began on December 20th, 1944, as German forces encircled the town, cutting off all supply lines and subjecting the defenders to relentless artillery and tank attacks. The weather, which had been a factor throughout the battle, now played a critical role. Heavy snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft, preventing resupply by air and limiting the effectiveness of American artillery. The cold was intense, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, and many of the defenders suffered from frostbite and exposure. Despite these hardships, the defenders of Bastogne were determined to hold the town. The paratroopers dug in, creating a defensive perimeter around Bastogne and preparing for the inevitable German assaults. The fighting was fierce and often hand-to-hand, with the Germans launching repeated attacks from all directions. Each attack was met with stubborn resistance, as the defenders used every available weapon to repel the enemy. One of the most dramatic moments of the siege came on December 22nd, when the Germans sent an ultimatum to the American defenders, demanding their surrender. The message, delivered under a white flag, was curt and to the point. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river Our than near or Theuville, have taken Marquet and reached St. Hubert by passing through Hamper-Sabret-Tillet. Libremont is in German hands. The ultimatum concluded with a stark warning. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy A battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2-hour term. General McAuliffe's response was brief and defiant. Nuts! The German officers who received the reply were reportedly confused, as the slang term was unfamiliar to them. But the message was clear. The defenders of Bastogne would not surrender. The siege continued, with the Germans launching increasingly desperate attacks in an attempt to break the American defenses. The defenders, despite being low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, held their ground. The paratroopers were supported by artillery from the 10th Armored Division, which had managed to get some of its guns into Bastogne before the town was completely encircled. These artillery units played a crucial role in repelling the German attacks, despite being short on shells. As the siege dragged on, the weather finally began to clear, allowing Allied aircraft to resume operations. On December 23rd, the first resupply missions were flown in, dropping much-needed supplies to the beleaguered defenders. The arrival of the supplies lifted the spirits of the defenders and gave them the means to continue the fight. The turning point in the siege came on December 26th, when elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army arrived to relieve the defenders of Bastogne. Patton's forces had made a rapid advance from the south, covering more than 100 miles in just a few days to reach the town. The arrival of Patton's tanks and infantry lifted the siege, and the defenders of Bastogne were finally able to go on the offensive, pushing the Germans back. The defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience and determination. The stand of the 101st Airborne Division, under incredibly difficult circumstances, was widely celebrated, and General McAuliffe's famous reply to the German surrender demand became a rallying cry for the Allies. The successful defense of Bastogne also marked a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, as the German offensive began to lose momentum and the Allies started to regain the initiative. While the defense of Bastogne and the battle for St. Vith are often the most celebrated engagements of the Battle of the Bulge, the fight for Elsenborn Ridge was equally critical to the outcome of the battle. Elsenborn Ridge, located in the northern sector of the Ardennes, was a key piece of high ground that dominated the surrounding area. Control of the ridge would allow the Germans to break through to the vital road networks and push towards their ultimate objectives of Antwerp and the Meuse River. The defense of Elsenborn Ridge was primarily the responsibility of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, along with elements of the 99th Infantry Division. These units were positioned along a series of ridgelines and hills that provided excellent defensive positions. The American commanders understood the importance of holding Elsenborn Ridge and had fortified their positions with trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. The German attack on Elsenborn Ridge began on December 16, 1944, as part of the broader offensive in the Ardennes. The German 6th Panzer Army, under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, was tasked with breaking through the American lines and capturing the ridge. The attack was spearheaded by elite SS Panzer divisions, supported by artillery and Luftwaffe bombers. The initial German assaults were met with fierce resistance. The American defenders, well entrenched and supported by artillery, repelled wave after wave of German attacks. The dense forests and rough terrain made it difficult for the German tanks to advance, and many were knocked out by American anti-tank guns and artillery. The fighting was intense and often confused, with small units of American infantry holding out against much larger German forces. The weather, once again, played a significant role in the battle. Heavy snow and fog limited visibility and made movement difficult for both sides. The cold was brutal, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, and many soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite and exposure. Despite these challenges, the American defenders held their ground, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking Germans. The critical moment in the battle for Elsenborn Ridge came on December 19th, when the Germans launched a massive assault, hoping to break through the American lines once and for all. The attack was preceded by a heavy artillery bombardment, followed by waves of infantry and tanks. The American defenders, however, were prepared. The artillery that had been pre-sighted on the approaches to the ridge rained down on the advancing Germans, while the infantry held their positions in the face of overwhelming odds. The German assault was eventually repelled, and the 6th Panzer Army was forced to call off its attempts to take Elsenborn Ridge. The failure to capture the ridge was a significant setback for the Germans, as it blocked their most direct route to Antwerp and the Meuse River. The American defense of Elsenborn Ridge was a textbook example of a well-executed defensive operation, and it played a crucial role in blocking the northern prong of the German advance in the Battle of the Bulge. The unyielding defense of Elsenborn Ridge forced the Germans to divert their forces to other, less favorable routes, further complicating their already difficult logistical situation. The ridge, with its commanding views and fortified positions, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the German forces. This battle demonstrated the importance of terrain and military strategy, as well as the value of determined, well-prepared defensive positions. The American units involved in the defense of Elsenborn Ridge, particularly the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, earned high praise for their tenacity and effectiveness. Their ability to hold the line under extreme conditions and against superior numbers was a testament to their training, leadership, and resolve. The success at Elsenborn Ridge contributed significantly to the overall failure of the German offensive in the north, as it prevented the 6th Panzer Army from breaking through and reaching its objectives. In the days following the failed German assaults, the front lines in this sector stabilized, with both sides digging in and preparing for the next phase of the battle. The Germans, having lost a significant amount of men and material in their attempts to take the ridge, were now on the defensive, and the initiative began to shift back to the Allies. As the Battle of the Bulge progressed, the importance of air power became increasingly evident. The initial success of the German offensive had been aided by poor weather conditions, which grounded Allied aircraft and limited their ability to conduct reconnaissance, provide close air support, and carry out strategic bombing missions. However, as the weather began to clear in late December, the full force of Allied air power was unleashed, turning the tide of the battle. The United States Army Air Forces, USAF, and the Royal Air Force, RAF, played a crucial role in disrupting German supply lines, destroying armored columns, and providing much-needed supplies to the besieged American troops, particularly those in Bastogne. The lifting of the fog and the arrival of clear skies on December 23, 1944, marked a turning point in the battle. The most immediate impact of the improved weather was the resumption of aerial resupply missions to the 101st Airborne Division and other units trapped in Bastogne. C-47 Skytran transport aircraft, escorted by fighters, began dropping supplies of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and other essentials to the beleaguered defenders. These airdrops were critical in sustaining the American forces during the siege and bolstered their ability to hold out against the German attacks. In addition to resupply missions, Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers took to the skies to strike at German columns and supply convoys. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its rugged design and ability to carry a heavy payload, became one of the most feared aircraft in the skies over the Ardennes. P-47s and other fighter bombers, including the P-38 Lightning and the Hawker Typhoon, conducted relentless strafing and bombing runs against German tanks, trucks, and infantry concentrations. These airstrikes were devastating to the German forces, who were already struggling with fuel shortages and logistical challenges. The destruction of key bridges, road junctions, and fuel depots by Allied bombers further compounded the difficulties faced by the Germans. The Luftwaffe, which had been a formidable force earlier in the war, was now a shadow of its former self, unable to effectively challenge Allied air superiority. The few German aircraft that did manage to get airborne were quickly intercepted and shot down by the Allied fighters. The impact of air power extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Strategic bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, targeted German infrastructure, including rail yards, factories, and oil refineries. These bombings crippled the German war effort and disrupted the flow of reinforcements and supplies to the front. The cumulative effect of these air operations was to weaken the German offensive to the point where it could no longer sustain its momentum. The contribution of air power to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge cannot be overstated. It not only provided critical support to the ground forces, but also demoralized the German troops, who realized that their initial gains were unsustainable in the face of overwhelming Allied air superiority. The resumption of air operations marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive and set the stage for the Allied counteroffensive that would eventually push the Germans back across the Rhine. By late December 1944, the German offensive had begun to lose steam. The initial shock and rapid advances had given way to fierce resistance, logistical difficulties, and increasingly effective Allied countermeasures. The failure to capture key objectives, such as Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, combined with the resumption of Allied air superiority, left the Germans vulnerable to a counterattack. The Allied counteroffensive began in earnest on December 26, 1944, as General George S. Patton's Third Army launched a series of coordinated attacks from the south. Patton, known for his aggressive and audacious tactics, had been preparing for this moment. His forces, including the 4th Armored Division, had been moving rapidly to relieve Bastogne and then to drive the Germans back. Patton's troops, supported by close air support and artillery, struck at the exposed flanks of the German forces in the Ardennes. The Germans, who had overextended themselves in their drive westward, were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the American counterattack. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but the momentum had clearly shifted to the Allies. At the same time, British forces under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched their own attacks from the north. Montgomery, who had taken overall command of the northern sector of the front, carefully coordinated his forces to apply maximum pressure on the German positions. The British, along with American units under Montgomery's command, advanced methodically, pushing the Germans back towards their starting positions. The combined pressure from Patton's Third Army in the south and Montgomery's forces in the north created a pincer movement that began to encircle the German forces in the Ardennes. The Germans, realizing the danger of being cut off and destroyed, began a gradual withdrawal. However, the retreat was anything but orderly. The harsh winter conditions, combined with relentless Allied air attacks, turned the German withdrawal into a chaotic and costly affair. Throughout January 1945, the Allies continued their advance, recapturing towns and villages that had been lost in the initial stages of the German offensive. The fighting was fierce, with the Germans putting up determined resistance in many areas. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had regained the initiative, and the German forces were in full retreat. One of the most significant aspects of the Allied counteroffensive was the rapid restoration of the front lines. Within weeks, the Allies had not only regained the territory lost during the German offensive, but had also advanced beyond it, setting the stage for the final push into Germany itself. The Battle of the Bulge, which had begun as a desperate gamble by Hitler to turn the tide of the war, ended in a resounding defeat for the Germans. The cost of the battle was enormous for both sides. The Germans lost tens of thousands of men, along with a significant portion of their remaining armored forces. The Allies, too, suffered heavy casualties, but they emerged from the battle with their forces intact and their morale high. The successful defense and counterattack in the Ardennes were seen as a turning point in the war, demonstrating the resilience and effectiveness of the Allied forces. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during World War II. It involved over 1 million men, including 600,000 Americans, 500,000 Germans, and 55,000 British. The battle resulted in approximately 75,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed, and between 80,000 to 100,000 German casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. The battle also saw significant losses in equipment and material on both sides, with the Germans losing much of their remaining armored strength. For the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge was a catastrophic failure. Hitler had gambled everything on the success of the Ardennes offensive, hoping to force the Allies into a negotiated peace, or at least buy time to strengthen Germany's defenses. Instead, the offensive drained Germany's already depleted resources, leaving the Wehrmacht weakened and unable to stop the Allied advance into the heart of Germany. The failure of the offensive also eroded the morale of the German military and civilian population, many of whom realized that the war was now lost. For the Allies, the battle was a hard-fought victory that demonstrated their ability to respond to and overcome a major crisis. The battle highlighted the resilience, adaptability, and determination of the Allied forces, particularly the American troops who bore the brunt of the fighting. The successful defense and subsequent counteroffensive in the Ardennes also demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied command and control, logistics, and air power. The Battle of the Bulge also had significant strategic implications. The failure of the German offensive meant that the Allies could resume their push into Germany without fear of a major counterattack. The battle delayed the Allied advance by several weeks, but it also destroyed much of Germany's remaining offensive capability. By the end of January 1945, the Allies were once again on the move, crossing the Rhine in March and advancing into the heart of Germany. In the broader context of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It was the last major offensive mounted by the Germans, and its failure paved the way for the final Allied victories in Europe. The battle also reinforced the importance of coalition warfare, as American, British, and other Allied forces worked together to defeat a common enemy. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge is one of courage, sacrifice, and determination. The men who fought in the Ardennes, particularly those who endured the bitter cold and relentless German attacks, are remembered as heroes who stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle is also remembered for the critical role it played in the eventual Allied victory in Europe, marking a decisive turning point in the war. Following the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies resumed their advance into Germany with renewed vigor. The collapse of the German offensive in the Ardennes left the Western Front in a state of flux, with the Germans retreating and the Allies pressing forward on all fronts. The final months of the war in Europe would see some of the most intense and decisive battles, as the Allies sought to bring the conflict to a swift conclusion. One of the key objectives for the Allies in early 1945 was to cross the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier between the Allied forces and the German heartland. The Rhine had long been considered a formidable defensive line, and the Germans had prepared extensive fortifications along its banks. However, the speed and momentum of the Allied advance caught the Germans off guard. In March 1945, American forces achieved a significant breakthrough when they captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a critical crossing point over the Rhine. The capture of the bridge was a major coup for the Allies, allowing them to establish a bridgehead on the eastern side of the river and enabling the rapid movement of troops and supplies into Germany. The bridgehead at Remagen became the launching point for a major Allied offensive into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. At the same time, British and Canadian forces launched their own offensive to cross the Rhine to the north, while French and American forces crossed to the south. The combined Allied offensives overwhelmed the German defenses and led to the encirclement of the Ruhr, trapping a large portion of the remaining German forces in the west. The Ruhr Pocket, as it became known, was systematically reduced by the Allies, leading to the capture of over 300,000 German soldiers and the destruction of Germany's industrial base. With the Ruhr neutralized and the Rhine crossed, the Allies advanced rapidly across Germany, facing only sporadic resistance from increasingly demoralized and disorganized German forces. The Allies liberated cities and towns as they moved eastward, uncovering the horrors of the Holocaust as they liberated concentration camps and witnessed firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. As the Allies advanced from the west, Soviet forces were making their own push into Germany from the east. The Red Army, which had already overrun much of Eastern Europe, crossed the Oder River in early 1945 and began its final assault on Berlin. The race to Berlin became the focal point of the final phase of the war in Europe, with the Soviets determined to capture the German capital before the Western Allies. The Battle of Berlin, which began in April 1945, was a brutal and bloody fight that saw the complete destruction of much of the city. The Soviets, seeking to avenge the devastation wrought by the Germans in the Soviet Union, showed little mercy as they fought their way through the city. German resistance was fierce, but ultimately futile, as the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the Red Army proved unstoppable. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, effectively signaling the end of the Third Reich. The remaining German leadership attempted to negotiate a surrender, but the Allies insisted on unconditional surrender. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Western Allies, and on May 9, the surrender was ratified by the Soviets, marking the end of World War II in Europe. The end of the war in Europe brought relief and jubilation to the Allied nations, but it also left a continent devastated by years of conflict. The war had caused unprecedented destruction, with millions of lives lost and entire cities reduced to rubble. The task of rebuilding Europe would be a monumental challenge, one that would require cooperation and assistance from both the victors and the vanquished. The Battle of the Bulge, as one of the final major battles of the war, holds a significant place in the history of World War II. It was a battle that tested the resolve of the Allied forces and demonstrated their ability to overcome adversity and achieve victory. The battle also served as a stark reminder of the costs of war, with its heavy casualties and widespread destruction. As the world moved on from the war, the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge and the broader conflict in which it was a part would continue to resonate. The battle is remembered not only for its strategic importance, but also for the courage and sacrifice of those who fought in it. It stands as a testament to the resilience and determination of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming challenges. In the years following the war, The Battle of the Bulge has been commemorated in numerous ways, from memorials and museums to books and films. It remains a powerful symbol of the Allied victory in World War II and a reminder of the sacrifices made to secure freedom and peace in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge was a brutal reminder of the horrors of war, but it also marked a turning point in the conflict. Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Battle of the Bulge in the comments below. Be sure to check out my other videos for more fascinating insights into other pivotal moments in history.